They tried to break him, but they didn't realize his soul was made of titanium and fire. Witness the incredible resilience of a human spirit that refuses to be contained or controlled. Hit subscribe today and find the unbreakable power within your own heart.
My aunt called me a financial sinkhole on a Tuesday, not to my face. I overheard it through the kitchen wall while I was setting the table for her dinner party, the one she'd invited me to specifically because, and I quote, family should stick together. I stood there holding a stack of her expensive ceramic plates, the kind she'd recently bought, the matte black ones I'd seen on her Instagram with the caption, "Finally treating myself," and I heard her say it to my uncle like it was just a fact, like the weather. Maya is a financial sinkhole. Some people just don't climb. I put the plates down very carefully and went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of her marble tub and did the math in my head. I was 28 years old. I worked 3 jobs. I left the hospital after 12-hour nursing shifts and went directly to a coffee shop where I stood for another 4 hours making lattes for people who never once looked up from their phones. On weekends, I picked up private home care shifts for elderly clients because the extra $200 covered my electric bill and sometimes my medication copay and occasionally both if I was lucky. I had a studio apartment that was technically a converted storage unit. The landlord called it a loft-style efficiency in the listing, and my bed was 6 inches from my stove. I ate rice and beans more days than I didn't. I had skipped 2 of my own prescription refills in the last year because I had to choose. And somewhere across town, in a house with a wine cellar and a 3-car garage, my aunt was calling me a sinkhole. I want to be clear about something before I keep going. I did not grow up expecting anything from anyone. My mother died when I was 11, and my father remarried and moved to Phoenix and sent birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside until I turned 18, and then he stopped doing even that. My grandmother raised me after that, Grandma Ruth. She was the kind of woman who kept her important papers in a shoebox under her bed and called the bank every Friday to confirm her balance and made the best pot roast I have ever tasted in my entire life. She told me once that she had set something aside for me. Not a lot, she said, but something. So that you always have a floor baby. So the ground never fully disappears under you. Grandma Ruth died when I was 24. 4 years before that Tuesday dinner, her estate, what little there was, went through my aunt, who was the executor. There was a small life insurance payout, a savings account, and the contents of the house. My aunt handled everything. I was 24 and grieving and working night shifts, and I trusted her completely because she was the only family I had left who was physically present, who showed up, who answered the phone. I received a condolence card, a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother, and her recipe binder. I was grateful. I didn't ask questions. Some people don't climb. The dinner party was in March. My aunt's house smelled like expensive candles, and whatever she was having catered, not cooked, catered, for a Tuesday dinner with 8 guests. I had driven 40 minutes after a closing shift at the coffee shop. I was wearing the nicest thing I owned, which was a blazer from a thrift store that I'd had dry cleaned once, and I was tired in the way that lives behind your eyes and doesn't fully go away even when you sleep. My aunt had recently redecorated. That was the word she used. Redecorated, but what she meant was that she had gutted and rebuilt an already beautiful house from the floors up. New kitchen, new bathrooms, new everything. She'd posted about it extensively. The contractor alone she mentioned over appetizers had cost more than I made in a year. Her daughter, my cousin Tiffany, was there with her boyfriend and a new bag that cost $3,000. I knew the price because Tiffany had mentioned it twice before the salad course. I sat at the table and smiled and answered questions about my work and my apartment and whether I was seeing anyone, and I kept thinking about that number. $3,000. That was more than 2 months of my rent. That was the amount I'd been trying to save for 6 months and kept failing to reach because something always came up. A car repair, a medical bill, a month where the coffee shop cut my hours. After dinner, when the other guests had drifted to the living room, I helped clear the table. My aunt came into the kitchen while I was stacking dishes, and she put her hand on my shoulder in a way that was probably meant to seem warm and said, "You know, I worry about you. You work so hard, and you never seem to get ahead. Have you thought about what you're doing wrong?" I said I thought about it all the time. She nodded like that confirmed something. I drove home at 11 o'clock that night, alone, in my 11-year-old car with a cracked dashboard, and I thought about my grandmother's voice saying so. The ground never fully disappears under you. And I cried for about 4 minutes on the highway, And then I stopped because I had a 6 a.m. shift and I needed to sleep. What happened next started with a mistake, and the mistake was my aunt's. She had been managing a family trust, something I didn't know existed, that Grandma Ruth had set up years before she died. It was modest by some standards, but it had been generating income quietly for years. And the trust had a named beneficiary. Me. I don't know exactly when my aunt began diverting the distributions. The financial advisor who eventually reconstructed the timeline told me it appeared to start within 6 months of my grandmother's death. The amounts varied, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but they were consistent, regular, intentional. The money came in and it went somewhere, and that somewhere was not me. Would have funded, based on what I later found in the documents, a kitchen renovation, 2 international vacations, Tiffany's college tuition top-up, and a significant contribution toward a beach property my aunt and uncle purchased in 2022. I want you to feel the weight of that. While I was splitting one prescription into smaller doses to make it last longer, while I was calculating whether I could afford both groceries and my electric bill in the same week, while I was sleeping 6 inches from my stove in an apartment my landlord euphemistically called a loft, my inheritance was paying for someone else's beach house. I found out because of a form my aunt had added me, apparently years ago, probably as a formality she forgot about, as a secondary contact on the trust account. When the financial institution updated their record system, they sent routine correspondence to all listed contacts. A letter arrived at my old address, forwarded twice, and finally reached me in April, 7 weeks after that dinner party. It was a statement. Not detailed. Just a quarterly summary with account information and a balance figure and the name of the account. The account name included my name, my full name, and my grandmother's. I sat with that letter for a long time. I read it 4 or 5 times, and then I called the number on the letterhead. The woman I spoke to was patient and professional and very careful with her words. She confirmed that yes, there was a trust, that yes, I was the named beneficiary, that she couldn't discuss the account details with me directly without documentation, but that I had the right to request them. I thanked her and hung up. And then I sat in my car in the parking lot of the pharmacy where I'd just picked up half a prescription because I couldn't afford the full one, and I thought about what I was going to do. I didn't call my aunt. I didn't call Tiffany. I didn't post anything or tell anyone. I called a lawyer. His name was Mr. Okafor. He was a trust and estates attorney with an office above a dry cleaner and a billing rate I paid in installments. I brought him the letter, and he looked at it and asked me a series of quiet, specific questions. And then he leaned back in his chair and said, "This is worth looking into." We spent 6 weeks looking into it. What Mr. Okafor found through formal document requests, subpoenaed bank records, and a forensic accounting review that cost me money I genuinely did not have was a paper trail. Clear, consistent, damning. My aunt had been the sole signatory on the trust since my grandmother's death. She had reclassified my distributions as administrative expenses and estate maintenance fees. She'd not filed the required annual accountings with the court. She had, in the language of the legal documents that were eventually filed, committed a systematic breach of fiduciary duty over a period of approximately 4 years. The total amount: just under $90,000. I want to tell you what $90,000 means to me. $90,000 is the medical debt I've been carrying since a hospitalization 2 years ago. It's the student loans I've been paying the minimum on. It's the down payment on an apartment that would mean I don't have to sleep next to a stove. It's the prescription I take the full dose of. It's the floor my grandmother said she was building under me. $90,000 is 4 years of my life lived in the wrong direction. My aunt did not know it was coming. Not even close. She had invited me, and this is still stunning to me, to a family birthday party for Tiffany, 2 weeks after Mr. Okafor filed the initial legal motion. I almost didn't go. My lawyer said I didn't have to, but there's a part of me that had spent 4 years feeling small and stupid and wrong, and I wanted to be in the room. The party was at a restaurant. Nice place. Private dining room with a floral arrangement in the center that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. My aunt was at the head of the table looking comfortable and in charge in the way she always did. Tiffany was opening gifts. My uncle was talking to someone about a golf trip. I arrived late, which was partly traffic and partly intentional. I sat down at the far end of the table, said hello, accepted a glass of water. The conversation moved around me for a while. Someone asked about my work. I said things were changing. My aunt asked what that meant. I said I'd been getting some paperwork sorted out. She nodded like that was boring and turned back to her conversation. About 40 minutes in, when the appetizers had been cleared and the entrees were being set down, my aunt's phone buzzed, then buzzed again. She glanced at it, then looked at it more carefully. Then her face did something I had never seen it do before. It went still. Not calm, still. The way a face goes when the brain behind it is suddenly working very hard on something unexpected. She looked up and found me at the other end of the table. I held her gaze for a moment and then I looked down at my food. What her phone had shown her, a formal legal notice, served electronically to her address of record from Mr. Okafor's office, a petition for an accounting of the trust, a motion for breach of fiduciary duty, and a request for an emergency asset freeze on the beach property and 2 associated accounts. She excused herself from the table. My uncle followed. They were gone for several minutes. Tiffany looked around like she wasn't sure she was still supposed to open gifts. I ate my salmon. When my aunt came back, she sat down and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as a door closing. She said, very quietly, that she needed to speak with me privately. I said I was happy to speak with her with everyone present. Her jaw moved. Then she said, also very quietly, this is a misunderstanding. We were managing the trust in your best interest. You weren't in a position to handle that kind of money responsibly. I looked at her. I thought about the pharmacy parking lot. I thought about the half prescription. I thought about sleeping next to my stove. I said, I'd like to hear that explanation in court. My uncle made a sound. Tiffany put down the gift she was holding. My aunt's expression went through several things very quickly and landed on something cold. She said, you're making a mistake. You don't have the resources for a legal fight. And I said, Mr. Okafor is working on contingency. What happened over the next 4 months is not dramatic in the cinematic way. It's paperwork and hearings and a lot of sitting in waiting rooms. But the outcomes were real. The emergency asset freeze was granted. The beach property went into legal hold. My aunt hired 2 attorneys, which tells you something about how seriously she took the situation once she understood it. The forensic accounting was entered into the record. The pattern was undeniable. Not just the amounts, but the reclassification of distributions as fees, the missing annual filings, the paper trail that led from my grandmother's account to my aunt's renovation contractor. Her attorneys tried 3 different arguments. The first was that she had exercised appropriate discretion as trustee. The second was that the distributions had been made on my behalf in indirect ways for my long-term benefit. The third, which I found genuinely stunning, was that I had implicitly consented by never asking about the trust. I had never been told the trust existed. Mr. Okafor was very good at his job. The case settled before trial. The terms are not something I'll discuss in full, but the key points are these. My aunt was removed as trustee. An independent trustee was appointed. The assets in legal hold were liquidated to fund restitution. And I received, over the course of 2 separate payments, a figure that, while not the full $90,000, came close enough to change the material reality of my daily life. I paid off the medical debt. I paid off most of the student loans. I put a deposit on an apartment with a bedroom and a separate kitchen. I refilled my prescriptions completely without math. I want to tell you the hardest part, because it would be easier to skip it. The hardest part was not the legal process. It was not sitting across from my aunt in a conference room while her attorneys argued that I was too irresponsible to have managed my own inheritance. It was not the months of uncertainty, or the nights I spent awake worrying the case would fall apart, or the moments when I wondered if I was wrong, if I had misread something, if maybe she had a point and I was making a mistake I couldn't undo. The hardest part was the voice in my head that had spent 4 years agreeing with her. The voice that said some people just don't climb. The voice that said, you work hard and never get ahead because something is wrong with you. The voice that I have been listening to instead of asking questions, instead of opening letters, instead of looking too closely at anything that might confirm that the ground my grandmother built was never taken away. It was stolen. There are people who will look at this story and say, I should have known sooner, should have asked, should have been more careful. Maybe they're right, but I was 24 years old and I was grieving and I was exhausted. And I trusted someone who had positioned herself as the person I was supposed to trust. That is not stupidity. That is exactly how it works. I moved into my apartment on a Saturday in October. I made my grandmother's pot roast recipe that evening. in my new kitchen, in a pot I'd had for years, but rarely used because my old stove wasn't reliable. I stood there and I thought about her telling me she was building me a floor. I thought about how she had done that, quietly, carefully, the way she did everything, and how someone else had decided that floor belonged to them instead. I thought about the word sinkhole, about being called a financial sinkhole by someone who had been quietly draining the account my grandmother left for me while I worked 3 jobs and split my prescriptions and smiled at dinner parties. I thought, the ground doesn't disappear when someone steals it. It's still there. You just have to find it. And I thought about Grandma Ruth, who kept her important papers in a shoebox under her bed and called the bank every Friday. And I think she would have found this entire situation very interesting. I think she would have sat very still and listened carefully and then said something quiet and devastating and exactly right. She would have made excellent use of a good lawyer. I have 2 things to say before I finish. The first is this. If someone died and left something for you and you were told there was nothing, or nothing significant, or it was handled, ask questions, get documents, call the institution. You have the right to know. Estate and trust fraud is more common than most people realize, and it is almost always committed by someone the victim trusts completely. Someone who positions themselves as the one handling things. Someone who counts on the grief and the exhaustion and the voice that says, you're probably wrong to do the asking. You're probably not wrong. The second is something my grandmother told me, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. She said, some things take a long time to come back around, but they come back around. She was right about that. She was right about most things. If you've been in a situation like this, or you know someone who has, drop it in the comments. You're not alone. And hit like if you think my grandmother would have made an excellent trust attorney. She absolutely would have.